Welcome to Eventualists, real stories, eventual experiences, a new Meetings Today podcast for tomorrow's talent and today's leaders, co-hosted by me, Hannah Elston.
And me, Taylor Smith. The Eventualist sheds light on the unexpected realities of life as a business events industry professional. And today we are excited to welcome our next guest. But before we do, Hannah, why don't you share one of your favorite moments from our last episode, which featured our first ever guest on Eventualist, Tyler Sturdivant, in case our listeners missed it and need a little recap?
Yeah, of course. Firstly, snaps for Tyler because she was absolutely incredible, and definitely want to hear more of her voice in the industry moving forward. But I would say something that people, if you haven't listened to it, you definitely should. She talks a lot about sort of standing up for yourself and your own career progression, making things happen for you and being an advocate for yourself and also reaching out for help when you need it. I just think she had so many insightful bits of information there to help you kind of navigate your expectations when you're starting a career in events and where that can go. But Taylor, was there something that you took away from that podcast you wanted to share?
I loved hearing Tyler's story because I was in Calgary last week with Tourism Calgary on a fam trip, and we were at lunch one day. I was speaking to another attendee, and we were talking about how the average amount of time that today's employees stay at a company, mostly Gen Z, but in general, is 2.2 years. So for me, approaching my fourth year at Meetings Today, and then hearing from Tyler how for 4 years she started as an intern at Inspire Brands and now she's assistant manager of events there. It was inspiring for me to hear that because I think a lot of Gen Z feels like they have to jump around to find opportunities right now. And they have to jump around and go to the next company to get that next paycheck and that next pay bump. And seeing that there are opportunities out there for people where there are companies that offer those opportunities for growth, I think was very, it's like heartwarming to know that someone feels so happy and comfortable in their job and they're giving those opportunities. And that's ultimately what we want to create more of for Gen Z. So I think her story was very relatable for me. Just for fun question for you, Hannah, what's a small win you're celebrating lately?
I mentioned on the last podcast that I was going skiing in the Alps, which I have now completed, and I learned how to parallel ski, which was very exciting. A lot of falling over, a lot of bruises, but I have left with a new skill, which is fantastic. So I'm celebrating that. Another thing that I am celebrating is my third cup of coffee of the day. It is 5:20. It's been one of those days as an event professional where you think, how else am I going to survive than copious amounts of caffeine? And now here I am recording this podcast with you. Taylor, what is something that you want to celebrate today?
See, I think a small win I want to celebrate is seeing the three sisters in Banff is something that, as the oldest of three sisters, that was just a very cool kind of like spiritual, nature-filled experience for me, and I loved it. Now let's get into the latest with a new eventualist, Preston Krzyzak, Customer Engagement and Growth Manager at Soundings. In his role, Preston is dedicated to ensuring client success. With a background in leadership, sales, and startups, he brings a unique blend of creativity and strategic thinking to the meetings and events industry.
Preston excels at matching the right talent to the right teams. His passion for people, consulting, and philanthropy fuels his business approach.
Today, Preston joins us to unpack the reality behind the labels, headlines, and stereotypes. From flexibility and feedback to financial security and work-life balance, the Eventualists explore what matters most to the next generation entering the events industry. Preston, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it is such a joy to be joined by you two. Super excited about the opportunity and platform that we have, and most importantly, just to hang out for a little bit and chat, right?
Right. Before we get started, Preston, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself a little bit beyond what I shared and maybe share a bit about your leadership experiences and what inspired us to have this conversation today?
Yeah, of course. So I am Preston. I grew up in the Chicago suburbs and then moved to the city afterwards. I went to university at Miami University, but funny enough, I did not graduate with any event background there. I actually graduated with a finance degree. So, coming into the events industry, it's, I think sometimes it's not a linear trajectory and sometimes it just unfolds in different ways. And I think that's what happened for me. So I ended up here, but now I am currently at Soundings Connect. We are a talent community that primarily places, freelance talent with the industry for different corporations, agencies, and associations in the world. So for my role in that company, I just work with the clients, with our customers, and ultimately look to place talent, drive growth within those current accounts, but then also ultimately bring in new opportunities and sales. So that's kind of been my current background with employment.
Being in your position where you not only match clients but talent in with companies, right? I think that really sets you up for this conversation. Like, on both sides what companies are looking for, but also what Gen Z wants. So I'm excited to talk to you today about it.
Preston, thank you for sharing more about your story and how you came to be in this role. I think something we like to ask all of our guests when we have them on is, how do you think your experience makes you an eventualist?
Yeah, so when I think of eventualists, I think, I don't necessarily think age, determines that factor, because what my definition and my, feeling towards it, it's wanting to grow, it's wanting to learn and ultimately become better within the industry, right? And I think for us, no matter where you are in your career, no matter where you are in life, the want to grow and the want to learn and become better, I think there's the beauty in that to always have that, right? But yeah, I think that mentality is always kind of ingrained into me as, the idea of being a eventualist, and to continuously want to grow and continuously want to develop and ultimately dream and change make and lead a generation, a Gen Z generation of what's to come and how we can ultimately grow and shape this industry for the better and together.
I think your mentality there and how you approach these growth opportunities, not just for yourself, your story just completely flips so many labels and stereotypes that Gen Z experiences on its head. If you put yourself next to all those labels, it's just like, Preston doesn't fit into any of these. He is on the outside of all these lazy, entitled, those words that get thrown at us and put on Gen Z all the time. So there's often a gap, right, because of these stereotypes and labels between how Gen Z is understood and perceived by older generations versus how they perceive themselves and what they're experiencing. From your perspective, why do you think this gap exists between how Gen Z employees see themselves and how some leaders or hiring managers perceive them in their roles?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think when we look at Gen Z, there's the narrative of this idea of work-life balance, right? I think that's a big push when we compare. Gen Z wants more days off and we want flexibility in our schedule and we want to, have this work-life balance, right? But like, what is really work-life balance, right? Because the way the industry is moving and just job, the way we do our job has changed dramatically with the increase in digital work. I think it's kind of changed from work-life balance to just quality of life, right? And you cannot blame a generation for just wanting to enjoy their life and have more power within that, right? And when we look at what has shaped Gen Z, I think we have to take it back from how we grew up in our community. We've gone through pre-K to 12, pre-K to, to high school, having community, having structure all our lives. Then we jump into, for the ones who went to university, you have even more community. It's hard not to have community in college. There's so many opportunities to be involved with different organizations, community involvement. And then we have all this structure, right? You have class, you have your schedule. Obviously, there's a less structure because it points you in the way where you have to control your own schedule. You live on your own now, but that sense is still there. But following we leave, college, you're back into the real world and there's just all this new opportunity and it could be daunting at times. But at the same way, traditionally we've had the idea of work being your next, your second place, right? Outside of home, work was your second place. In high school, school was your second place. And then traditionally we have work as our second place, but with the increasement in hybrid work or even fully remote virtual work, that has changed where your second place is no longer that structured work environment. Your second place is kind of set up for you, and especially for new people, moving to new cities, going back home or anything like that, that kind of leaves you. And I think that drives into the idea of isolation. that our industry, our generation, as isolated as possible. We are as lonely as possible. We call it the lonely generation because we have the rise of technology and social media, but we also have this rise of the way that structure around us has changed. And I think that has led to, all this depression. We're the most depressed, generation. Anxiety is at an all-time high because we're lonely. We don't have that human interaction. And I think that what drives those different factors when we talk about mental health, when we talk about depression, when we talk about anxiety, things that are not talked about enough in our generation and the root causes for that. And then we throw on top of social media and the facade that we see that people are living these lives on all these things. And it's a fake reality, but we compare ourselves to what is being seen. And sometimes they say comparison is a thief of joy. And I think that's, you look at that and you think of, well, why are we so sad and lonely and depressed? And what does that lead to outside into the workplace? I think we have to start there and have the conversation about what the actual impacts are and where that came from.
Are we creating an environment where Gen Z can really thrive, where we're meeting their needs?
I feel like what you touched on there as well, Preston, is such a sad irony that this generation is more connected than any other generation has ever been. And at the same time, we've never been so lonely. You have your entire contact book at your fingertips at all times. But because we've removed that physical aspect and that need to physically be there for each other, it's so much easier to feel more lonely. I mean, even when you have loads of connections that you might never even see, it's just such a crazy concept. Like, if we were to go back and tell someone 100 years in the past that this is how we would all be working and communicating with each other, and that people are falling in love with people they've never even seen before or don't know if they are who they say they are, it's just absolutely ridiculous how connection has changed as time has gone on. And it's definitely had an effect on us as a generation as a whole. And I think it's interesting that some people wouldn't necessarily see it that way, or, don't understand why we are a little bit more dissociated, when actually everything that's happened to us since we've been born has been so different. The way that technology has advanced in just, I'm 25 years old, so say since the year 2000, that advancement in just 25 years is at a rate that no other generation has ever seen before. If you talk to someone who was born in 2000 and also someone like my brother who was born in 2007, in just 7 years, our experiences are so incredibly different. He's 18 right now, but his reality with technology is so different than mine. Like, I still had cassette tapes.
I watched Disney movies on VHS.
Exactly, but he doesn't even know what that is, or never owned one, and it's just in that such a short space of time. So it's so interesting how it has changed so quickly, and I feel like it's incomparable to what other people have experienced. Touching on that, what do you think Gen Z are hoping to find from the workforce today that maybe previous generations didn't prioritize as much?
Yeah, I think the idea of that flexibility has definitely been an increase in wants. And when we look at why does our generation care about flexibility and, the need to have, we talk about like guidelines, right? And we're more, transparent about what we want from this, what we will have and what we will not take. And I think that it comes from different developments. When we look at flexibility, I think the first thing is we're the first generation that has fully moved into this hybrid working style. When we traditionally have always worked as, a banker's hour, right? A 9 to 5, right? With the in-personness. That has completely shifted right now because especially in COVID, how that had really increased, working from home is at an all-time high, but also working beyond that 9 to 5 schedule has changed tremendously because now that you are taking your office to your own place, in theory, you are on call 24/7. Obviously, that's a big over exaggeration, but the point remains true where because you're not in the office does not mean you are not working at that time, right? So now when we are in a generation that is 27%, I believe so, right, a part of the workforce, and it's only going to be increasing, we grew up in that change through, school and stuff. And now where we are now, where we see how involved technology is in our day and beyond working typical working structure, we want to, incorporate our life within that work style, right? Because typically at 5 o'clock, you're done, you go home and you have the rest of your day. But now that has changed. How can we incorporate things that we want, not necessarily for that work-life balance, but that quality of life factor to make sure that you are doing things that you still want to do within your work schedule? So it's about the blend. It's not necessarily about, I want to do this at this time and this at this time, but how can I make everything work cohesively so I can enjoy my life while doing work within my life, versus just completely oscillating the two.
Exactly. I feel like such a good example for this as well is when, let's say you have like a doctor's appointment or a dentist appointment or anything that you need to do where it's so conveniently placed within the middle of your day. You know, thinking back, gosh, like even just like 20 years ago, people would have to, request that time and then, make sure they get there and then log that in, and then they wouldn't be paid for that time and, all of this stuff. But actually having that flexibility, it means, okay, I can tell who I'm reporting into that I have an appointment at 11. I'll go to that. I'll come back. I'll make up the time later because my laptop is just up my stairs. And it's having that flexibility with the schedule where we're not asking for less time at the desk. We're just asking to break that time up so that we can still do other things in our life that we need to do or that give us fulfillment. Sometimes it's nice to actually go and have lunch with a friend that lives nearby because I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that when working from home. And that might mean, maybe I spend an extra half an hour there, but that's fine because I started work an hour earlier because I didn't have to commute in. So I think you're right. It's sort of allowing us to shift our working time around other elements that give us a better quality of life.
For me, when it comes to flexibility, what I appreciate most, I work entirely remote. I've never worked in an office setting before. My office is, down 3 flights of stairs in the basement, and that's where I spend most of my days. But one thing that I appreciate most about the flexibility is, as a creative, my brain, my writer brain, does not turn on until later in the day. That is just the reality. If you sit me down at 8 a.m. and tell me to crank out 1,000 words for you, they are going to be those words are not going to sound great. They are going to struggle on that page. But tell me to write something, at 1,000 words at 4 p.m. and that's easy peasy for me. And so one thing that I've really appreciated about the flexibility and being able to work from home is when I am hitting that wall and I'm not getting writing done in the morning, I could throw my laundry in or something, and I could catch up on emails or do something that is not as tedious, I guess, on my brain. And later in the day, if I know that I'll be writing 5 to 7 p.m., 8 o'clock, sometimes I take a longer lunch break, and communicating that with my boss, making sure he's aware, like, hey, I might be gone like an hour and a half today, but you could check my Teams bubble at 6:30 and you'll see that it's still green and I'm still working hard. That has been so appreciated by me and so rewarding because my writing is better because of that flexibility that I'm given, and my job feels easier because I'm able to do it when I know I will be most productive in certain ways. And I think that's something that remote work has made possible, and also something that Gen Z has just kind of normalizing a bit more. And I know I'm very privileged to be able to, write and get creative at night and kind of spread those hours apart. But that's something that I think the world is just shifting to doing more often. And this work-life balance kind of thing is more about, like Preston said, I don't know if it's work-life balance or just quality of life. Like, that's when I work best. That's how my life kind of revolves best, when I could kind of split it up in between the day. So, yeah.
Hey, I think you touched on something really important there, and it's about communication. So, we have this label that we are entitled sometimes. We see it everywhere. Gen Z are entitled, or they think this and they think that. If, we assume, oh, we can just go and take 2 hours for our lunch, or, oh, we can just go and do this, then yes, that is going to come across as entitled. But it's having that communication with your superior and saying, this is what I would like to do. This is going to make me work better in the long run. Please, can, I go ahead and do this? Then that's where we move away from entitlement and we come into, okay, we're recognizing this, and actually everything that you still want to get done is going to get done, but actually to a better degree, because I'm going to come back more refreshed. I'm going to come back with less things on my mind, or being less stressed and not feeling micromanaged. And I feel like all of that stems from just communicating well with your boss and not being afraid to do that.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of ties into this next question that I have for Preston, which, you know, we are being more open about flexibility and work-life balance. And I think Gen Z is much more open about stating their needs and being outspoken when it comes to that. When it comes to this flexibility and work-life balance, Preston, do you think this is a generational shift, or do you think it's something that previous generations have always wanted, but maybe didn't feel empowered enough to ask for at the time?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's a unique, right? Because when we talk back to work-life balance, right, where has that originated from, right? And I think we have such an increase in technology and the ability, and I think we touched on this just previously now, but with the, with COVID happening and the work of digital, the ask for work-life balance, I think it's new, right? When we look back from the younger generations where your office was stationary, right? And there was a structure and a corporate time. And I know some industries work in different ways where you are working past 5 o'clock. If you're an investment banker in the 1990s or whatever, you are working past 5 o'clock. I understand that there's different time allotments for different needs and jobs. But the point is, right, your office was in person, right? And that when we talk to the older generations, right, there's the idea that the hard work, like you have to put in the long hours, you have to put in the hard work because your reward will come afterwards. But I think that tonality and shift has changed, right? And now it's like, what are we wanting for? Like, obviously, we want to be great in our career. We want to be successful. We want to be rich. Who doesn't want to be rich, right? But I think also it's about how can we enjoy the now when we work toward that, right? Because life is not necessarily about the final outcome, but our enjoyment now. And it's how can we maximize this? And I think especially with the rise, with technology and, we're moving from working in the office to now, it's how can we make that all blend better together? So I think it's a newer ask, right? And we look at millennials or even Gen X, right? Where it's like, how they have adopted that culture too of being able to be hybrid and remote. But I think there's one thing too that I want to touch point on was Gen Z doesn't want to be fully remote, right? The idea that community is so important. And I think that gets under talked about, especially when we're in a generation that is so lonely. We want that community. But I think how can we blend community but also being, efficient? And I think that's the hybrid working model, I think, is really going to be the future, right? Because we talk about asynchronous work. Taylor, you work best at 10 p.m. You don't work best at 8 a.m. So it's
I'm
not
writing
necessarily
away in the middle of the night, man.
right. Because a lot of times we talk about where, but it's also about when too. I think that's the power into it. So how can we blend both together? And I think the hybrid working style is really going to be the power because we want that community, but we also want that flexibility to work on because we want a dynamic and creative life where everything is not the same, copy and paste. We want that ability to flex up and flex down. And I think, um, yeah, I think it's interesting in our generation of how can we get there to fully maximize and change the new the new era of working.
I think the meetings and events industry is especially positioned to be able to do that, right? We're literally here to build that community, to create opportunities for people to find communities and network. And going back to the loneliness epidemic, what is what we're experiencing in the States, especially with Gen Z facing that, and like getting Gen Z out and into a room with others like them, whether it be in their professional lives or personal, whatever. That's literally what our careers in this industry is here to do. And I think that's something that needs to be emphasized too, is we can create these opportunities where we're building community and answering Gen Z's calls and needs just by nature of doing what we do. So that's something I wanted to point out too.
Absolutely. And I think it's unique too, because when we define a hybrid can mean so many things. And I think especially within our industry, we are an industry that's built to combat our problem of, being away. Like we are community. We put people together. And I think it's so wonderful. And I think especially within our generation, living right now where we don't have enough community, it's how can we're going to combat for that, right? And try to bring as many people more and more together. And I think it's yeah, like whether it's in office or just traveling to, the events and programs or just being collectively with your team to have that face-to-face time, I think there's a lot of wonder in that of being able to have a nice mix and blend between the both.
I remember as when I started at meetings today, like my interview was on Zoom. I started in May of 2022, and I didn't meet Tyler Davidson, my boss, chief content director of meetings today, until IMEX that year. So in October, all I knew of Tyler was this little square box on my screen, right? I knew that he was awesome. I knew that I could talk to him about stuff, but I'd never met him. And until I had the opportunity to, it's weird, right? You're like, you want to like trust this person. And I did trust him. And I felt Tyler was so communicative and open. And this was the first time he was really kind of training a Gen Zer and under his wing too, who worked in not only, a different place, not in an office, but I was in Chicago and he was in North Carolina. Like we were so far apart, and I had no opportunity to like build a relationship with my mentor or my boss and show him who I am outside of these Teams calls. And that puts a lot of pressure on a new hire to build that trust, like Tyler Sturdenant was talking about in our first episode, when you haven't even met them in person. And when I did meet them, that IMEX, it was like the most magical moment. I was like, oh my gosh, there's more to you than just this little head that I see on Teams every day. And that's when I felt my relationships with my team really started to form, and they really got to know who I am, like outside of the professional hat I wear on calls or interviews.
Well, I was just going to say that that was the beginning of your career, Taylor. Mm-hmm. So your whole introduction into not just this industry, but into working life as a Gen Z was to not even have met your boss in person for the first 6 months. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's true for so many of us. And when we go back to talking about, what it is Gen Z want, I think we actually want a little bit of understanding that these things are hard for us because of these scenarios that we've been putting, networking, for example. We haven't even set foot in an office. We haven't had to do this in person before. Like you're saying, you were just sat behind a desk for the first 6 months, and now all of a sudden go out in the wild. I think something that Gen Z really value is communication, as we're saying, that transparency, and just a little bit of acknowledgement of, hey, maybe I'm not going to know exactly what I'm doing, but that is because this is my first time coming into working life, and all I've ever known is my own space and my own screen and my own
I'm navigating it on my own.
So maybe we do need a little bit of hand-holding sometimes, but just think about why and how daunting that would be if you were starting your work life. I started my career in the pandemic in the events industry. So that was an insane concept. Never went into an office. I didn't step foot in an office for the first 2 years. And I remember seeing everyone and being like, oh my God, you're way shorter than I thought you'd be. Or way taller than I thought you'd be. And having that moment. But it's interesting how it's great we're able to build these relationships behind a screen, but they're never going to be quite the same. And just having some understanding and some empathy that Gen Z are the way that they are because this is their introduction, is something that I think we want from leadership.
I think Gen Z in general just values that frequent feedback and transparency. So both, even when they are in an office setting, but especially when they're remote, how can leaders provide that feedback, Preston, without feeling like they're constantly micromanaging Gen Z or, like we said, hand-holding? And is it really about feedback or something deeper like trust and visibility and establishing those relationships even when you are on opposite sides of the country?
Yeah, it's about being seen and heard, right? I think at the end of the day, every human just wants to be seen and heard. So that transparency, obviously it's vital within, just to make sure that you can grow within your role and opportunity and make sure that you are being a team player and become successful at what you are currently doing. But I think the deeper meaning is we want visibility on us. We want the opportunity. Do you see me? Do you hear me? Do you actually listen to me? Because I think we really value that, right? And where does that condemn from? Well, I think that's just human nature thing, but specifically within our industry, again, tying back to the epidemic, the idea that we're more isolated, we really crave and, cultivate those moments where we can build that community, and building that community with, leaders, I think is really valuable for us. And from the leadership perspective, I think it's a point where you don't want to micromanage. And sometimes it could almost be an annoyance where it's like, well, they're always asking for this and they always want reassurance, right? Like the idea is like, I cannot provide you reassurance. I do not have time to provide you reassurance as you are my employee. Like, I'd love to support you. And motivate you and mentor you, but I cannot provide that reassurance every day because I do not have that time, right? So I think it's, maybe changing the way we kind of view that in a way where it's like, as a leader, you need to challenge your employees, like to really grow and to really be, you know, move past an obstacle. We have to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations to really understand, fail, fall on the ground to get back up and know how to move forward in those moments. So I think if it's for leaders, it's to really challenge your employees, but also making it we're in a community where you are still having the idea of trust, right? And I sometimes view this, and I look at you too, right? And I think with how you are so successful in your, your career and your current role is, right, you have empowerment from leadership. You have the opportunity to do things that you want to do, and then you have the platform that you enjoy in. And I think that ultimately cultivates into the idea that you have purpose. You're doing purpose-driven work. And when you're doing purpose-driven work, you have motivated employees, and it all comes together and it works together. And that builds team culture, that your output is better as an employee. And overall, I think that leads to a more successful relationship. But if we are not if we don't have passion in what we care about, if we don't have the purpose, if we don't believe in our company, I think that's where the line separates further and further, and that's when we become bad workers.
I completely agree with that. And I think that purpose-driven type, that's a label that Gen Z gets. And some people think it's a good thing. Some people think it's not the greatest. But one thing that I think sets Gen Z apart in like other generations, when they saw a job, it was just a job. It was just what they did, where they had to go from 9 to 5 every day to make money. It was not so much a part of their identity, maybe, as careers are for Gen Z. Like who I am as a writer, as a B2B journalist in the meetings and events industry, that is a part of me. That is how I identify. Like I am a writer through and through, like to my core. That's not just a job title for me. That is something I've done since I was 8 years old, that my passion is behind that. I do feel like I have a purpose. And I think that's another thing that Gen Z, that's might be why they kind of like explore different roles and try different things and hop around in industries, because we are just trying to find a job that makes us feel like work isn't punishment and it's not something we have to do. It's something we want and enjoy doing. And I guess we did get a viewer question that kind of relates to this, Preston, where Gen Z stereotype as job hoppers, quote unquote. There's a lot of conversation around that. I mentioned earlier that the average length of time that people are staying in their jobs today is 2.2 years, right? I'm approaching 4, so I'm already like doubling that. And that blows my mind. But in your experience, especially working with freelancers and companies and connecting employees to one another, is that really about loyalty, or is it more about like this lack of growth opportunities or lack of purpose maybe in where they are, and this desire to want to find something that does fulfill their needs?
I think it's twofold in the sense where when we look at today with the ability, let's look at how we can get new jobs, right? It is easiest, not necessarily that the job market's booming and it's lustrous opportunities everywhere, but I'm saying more so the ability to get new jobs and the platforms that we exist in with technology and LinkedIn. Like you open up your phone, hey, I have 5 jobs that you are a good fit for. It is in your face. The technology that has been built and that has been put on us has now, almost suffocated us with all these, new job hirings, this and this, right? So like the ability to, have interest in wanting to move new jobs, I think is an all-time high, because when we just look at technology in general, right? But beyond that, right, like I think the human nature is like you'll never leave a good opportunity that's right for you, right? Like we don't just have like the knack to like, oh, I want to move and switch, right? But I watched this TED Talk earlier, and I think there was a shift in the generational impact there, where they asked this question to everybody standing. It was, would you rather sit if you agree with this, stand if you wanted to, right? And it was about 60-40, right? The 60% were asked that were remaining standing were, would you rather work the same job every day for the rest of your life, every year, like you stay at one job, or you have to switch jobs every year for the rest of your life, right? And this was more Gen X, millennial, in the boomer industry or the boomer generations, 60% wanted to, I'll stay at my same job, right? They switched that with with our generation, and it was the inverse. I think it was 70-30. 70% of Gen Z would switch jobs, right? But when we look at that, I think it's just the human nature. We want to learn from different people, from grow from different opportunities to fully cultivate our mind and have this diverse perspective and work in different areas. So I think that, adds to the point, but because it's easier to move opportunities, that could maybe lead to that, transition to switch, right? And I know it's also really tied to financial security, right? And money stuff.
I can't believe that statistic, Preston, about the sort of millennials and Gen X actually wanting to stay predominantly, not everyone, but the majority wanting to stay in one role like forever. I think that's taken me by surprise, but I'm not surprised at the alternative with Gen Z saying that they would rather have a different job every year. And I think you've hit the nail on the head about it being more about experience and learning from lots of different avenues. And I think that is something that the events industry can offer really well, especially with positions in agencies. Being able to work on different projects and different events whilst all staying in one role is amazing. But for the most part, there are so many different things that different organizations and companies can offer us that make them attractive to add to our CV or our resumes, and those learnings that we can take from working with new people. If you're going to work with the same people all the time behind the same screen, then you're not going to learn new things, are you? So I can see why that's appealing. And the other thing you mentioned, which I'm glad you did, because I love getting a little bit awkward and talking openly about this, is the whole financial security. Now, financial security is becoming a bigger topic for younger professionals right now. How do you think, Preston, that money and stability are shaping career decisions that Gen Z is making?
I think it's a great question. And I think the first thing I want to point out is that for all generations, money matters, right? Financial security matters too. And I know Gen X, right? When you look at Gen X, for example, right? They came out of the, I think it was really 2008 when they were more earlier career, right? And, we had 9/11 and the whole, war there. Like there's been always turn of events that have impacted everybody's job security. So what's happening right now with the AI bubble or past COVID, there's been similar events, maybe not to different magnitudes, right? But everyone's been affected in the job culture. So I understand from all perspectives that the job hunt and the job search is different, right? And we've always wanted to fight for higher salaries. And I especially think within this industry, and I think when we talk about salaries, I don't think it's just a generation thing, that's an industry thing. I look at different industries and I see that, with inflation and stuff like early salaries, like our generation as a whole, we are projected to be less wealthy than our parents. The first
generation ever. Yep. First generation that'll happen to.
That's scary, right? That's scary that we're going to be less wealthy. And when we think about different ways where it's like a lot of people talk about like the bank of mom and dad or taking on loans and debt and can the government repay my student loans? Like we have all these conversations, but nothing's materialized. And I think it's a scary situation. Home ownership's at the lowest right now for our generation. We're getting married later, much later, right? So we're having families later in life and we're only later in life. We have this longer period out of college where it is like, it's almost like an open book for like, what's going to happen because there is no roadmap to success and that roadmap is getting delayed. And I think that even complaints to what we talk about with our whole community factor where it's like, we don't have a family earlier. We don't have our own family early on in our lives. And, people can not have a family or not. It's up to their decision. But I think it's just interesting to look at. But back to the finance piece, it's like, how do we want stability and how do we want stability to have that quality of life again, right? And like I think a lot of people when they look at new opportunities, it's like, can I afford to move into a city and or do I have to live with do I have to have 4 roommates, right? Or can I even move into the city or do I have to still stay at home? I think a big thing is just getting out of your parents' house after college, right?
Anyone want to let me know when that'll happen?
Right? Like you've lived your whole life. You went through school for 4 years, you've done all this and like you had this sense of empowerment afterwards. You leave college where it's like, I can start my own life and start my own career. And then it's like, oh, JK, like you're going back home, you're under your parents' control again. And now you're working again. And I think that sense of wanting to have ownership in your life it gets removed and the financial barrier is always going to be the biggest separation factor. So I did read this one report though from Deloitte. Said 50% of our generation has side hustles or
that does not surprise me.
Or side interests. Yeah.
There's an increase in entrepreneurship too, because instead of taking jobs for other people, Gen Z's like, well, screw that. I'm going to go work for myself, start my own business. And a lot of them are doing creative things, creative outlets. So I think that's kind of interesting too.
I think a lot of us see the lifestyle that can be when you have that, that much extra income. And I don't know about you two, but I have tried to do a solo entrepreneur moment. I've come up with so many different ideas to try and start a business and, start making my own money on the side and all of this. Um, Working in events, try to find that work-life balance already, and then trying to work in a side hustle into that to give that extra income. Man, that's hard.
Mhm.
And I think this is why a lot of us, unfortunately, are like, I need someone to move in with because I can't do this solo. I can't pay those bills solo and work a full-time job and also make a side hustle work sustainably. Some of us are fantastic and obviously can, but that's very hard. And I think especially within our industry and how much time we give, our own weekends. Sometimes, I got to travel halfway across the world on the weekend for an event, right? Like trying to incorporate that and starting a business and maintaining that and also doing what's expected of me at work is very, very hard. And I was just looking at some good old stats on inflation, as we all love. And I thought I'd see, how are things compared to when we were born, right? Let's look at that. When we were birthed into this world, what did our parents think for us and what would be? So the national average, like income and house earnings, was 4.5. So, sorry, the average house prices was 4.5 times the average salary, okay, when we were born. And it is now in 2024, so I'm assuming in 2026 it's already gone up, is over 8 times the average salary.
That sounds about right.
Why you need 2 people working to make sure you can actually afford somewhere, or just, that you're house sharing or flat sharing. And that is a hard reality when you're scrolling on Instagram and there are 26-year-olds that are partying on yachts and going to the Louis Vuitton store and showing off everything they're getting because they're a solo entrepreneur and they did it this way and they're an influencer and all of this stuff. And you're like, okay, I'm working as hard as I possibly can. I'm giving all these extra hours, even with a side hustle. Those things are not always attainable. And I feel like there's an element of fantasy versus reality here, and the reality hurts. And we just want to be paid a little more to get a little closer to that goal, because every little helps, especially in this cost of living crisis that we're in now and have been in for so long.
I think it will become even more interesting as we approach 2030 and Gen Z officially takes over as the number one generation in the workforce. We are no longer trickling in. We're coming in hot, coming in waves, and eventually we're going to be running the show, right? In a couple of years, we will be taking on those leadership roles in the industry and just in the workforce in general. That is going to create a shift in a lot of ways, I think. So to wrap up today, Preston, if you could predict the future, like if you had a magic crystal ball, how do you think workplace culture in the events industry might evolve over the next decade as people like us start taking over?
Yeah, I will write this down. Or this is going to be a really cold take in the future. Okay. I think one thing is right now we're in a really interesting time on a political side of things, on a technology side of things. We don't know what tomorrow is going to look like, right? We don't. And I think right now, when we look in the situation with AI, it is ridiculous how fast it is moving. Every day there's something new, and it's progressing at a crazy thing, and we cannot adopt it. And I'm so curious to see how that is going to evolve into our workforce and how much it's going to empower us, but also diminish us. So I think it's an interesting take there. But I think when we look at our generation and what we want from the industry, I think the big thing is we value community, and we always want that community. And the idea of community being taken away or just having a different sense of that, I'd invest into the industry at a large, because I think we're really going to really empower the idea. We are the solution to this national problem of how we are isolated, right? And I think there's different ways that different generations have combated this. Associations are really large in our industry, right? We have Taylor, we know each other through site, right? Like that's an association where we've connected. And you have MPI, you have PCMA, you have all these different associations, right? I know it was really powerful within millennials and Gen X, and even the boomer industry too, right? Where it really started. I don't know if our generation really takes full advantage of those associations. I think that's one interesting to think about. And it's like maybe asking why and like how can, because that's a sense of community there. So what's our approach on that, right? Are we doing something unique in the association world? Are we doing some different ways that we can connect and have community? I think that's a question to be had, but overall for what we in 10 years from now, how our generation is going to look, I think we just really want to bring that community back and encourage togetherness and collectiveness at an all-time high, and really also empower Gen Z. I do want to say this one feature that I found I was reading. So Gucci in 2017, right, because their customer base was older, they did a shadow committee of Gen Z and early millennials, right? So the youngest millennials. They did a shadow committee. They increased their revenue by like 137% over select different years, right? Because they had those people, because they were marketing their brand to the people that they didn't know, right? Because they were a different industry and they're marketing to their brand that they had no sense on because they weren't a part of that industry. So they brought in shadow committees. I really love the idea of how can our generation get more involved. Shadow committees, having that empowerment of leadership, of just being seen, but also having the opportunity to take something and run with it, whether it's shadow committees, whether it's Gen Z communities, whether it's other ways we can be involved with leadership, to be more purposeful and passionate about our work and connected to the outcome. I think there's different ways we can get really involved. And I would really challenge any leaders listening to this. How can you have Gen Z more involved on leadership and outcomes and overall strategy outside of execution? Because I think there's a lot of cool things that we can do. Walt Disney started Disney World when he was 21 years old. George P. Johnson started his marketing company. He was 26 years old. Marriott, the guy who started Marriott was 28 years old. Reggie with Cvent, 30 years old, right? Right on the cusp of what Gen Z would be right now. All these groundbreaking and foundational companies and industries were started by a lot of young people, and with the vision and the drive and the mindset to want to make change. And I think it's really when we look at our leaders now, it's how can we empower us and give us a chance. I'm not saying we don't have a chance, but
no, I think it all goes back to really why Hannah and I started this podcast, which is stop talking about Gen Z and invite us to be a part of the conversation too.
Retweet.
I love that so much. I think that is the perfect note to wrap up with today. Thank you so much, Preston, for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. This has been such a fun conversation, actually. I've really enjoyed spending time with you today. So thank you for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It was an honor, and I wish you all the best of luck with the podcast continues to evolve and develop, because I think you two are the best of hosts, and I think you guys are so brilliant, so powerful in your career, and I think it's only the beginning, because I think you got 2 stars right here, and you're just shining brighter every day.
Oh, thanks, Preston.
Cry, Preston.
I know, get teary-eyed.
Taylor, let's do the outro before I burst into tears. Thank you.
Yeah, Hannah, take us home.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of Eventualists and diving into real questions and experiences shared by us and our listeners. For more Eventualists content, follow Meetings Today's social media platforms and eventualists.podcast on Instagram.
Whether it's a bold question, an anonymous confession, or a candid conversation with a courageous podcast guest, the Eventualists are here to unpack it, openly, honestly, and without judgment, to help teach emerging leaders lessons they will find useful in their careers eventually. We're your co-hosts, Taylor Smith
and Hannah Elston. This episode was produced by Meetings Today's Maddie Willis. If you like this conversation, add to it. Email Maddie at eventualists.podcast@gmail.com.
New episodes of Eventualists will air every third Thursday of the month. Thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to sharing more experiences and conversations with you eventually.